The talk, in fact, is on the relation between belief and imagination. And when I say imagination, like in the previous talk, I mean propositional imagination. So imagining that something is the case, which is also sometimes called make-believe or belief-like imagining, because it is similar to belief in important respects. So they are both propositional attitudes, and perhaps most importantly, they are both cognitive attitudes. Attitudes that somehow regard their contents as true. So whether I believe or imagine, for instance, that I won the lottery, somehow I regard my winning the lottery as being the case, as being true in some word, even if in the case of imagination it's a fictional word. But this is different from conative attitudes, for instance, that regard their contents as to be made true. So in spite of these and other actually important similarities, of course, there are differences between believing and imagining. So believing that I won the lottery is different from imagining that I won the lottery. The question, one important question is, where is the difference? And this is the question I want to discuss in this talk. So at least I want to make some progress in addressing this question. And I will argue that the standard answer that is given has some problems and should be modified in one important respect. So the natural starting point to address this question are cases of daydreaming, engagement with fiction, indeed, and games of pretense. These are what we can call standard imaginative explananda. So are the phenomena of our lives that most obviously requires us to postulate an imaginative capacity somehow distinct from belief in order to be understood properly. And so my question basically is, how do the cognitive states underlying our engagement with daydreams, fiction, and pretense differ from belief? And according to the dominant view in the contemporary debate, the relevant difference here lies at the functional level. So our cognitive states in daydreaming, engagement with fiction, and pretense can have precisely the same contents as our beliefs, but they differ from beliefs in two key functional respects. So on the one hand, with respect to cognitive inputs, since imaginings are not formed in response to real-world evidence as beliefs are, and on the other hand, with respect to behavioral outputs, since imaginings do not motivate us to act as beliefs do. And this view is really pretty standard. So once Sean-Nichols said that these two differences are central facts about the propositional imagination that have shaped almost all theorizing in the recent literature. And I could mention many authors who agree on this. I don't agree that they are facts, as you will see, but I agree that they are widely shared. And importantly, this standard view is not even challenged by cases of pretense. So there are controversies on pretense, because there are people who think, actually quite a few authors recently argued that pretense actions are motivated by what we imagine. But even those who think that do not take pretense to reveal that imagination has the same motivating power as belief. They think, okay, pretense reveals that imagination has some motivating power. But many authors like Curry and Ravenscroft or Egan and Doggett, they think, for instance, that in pretense, imagination motivates jointly not with the real desires, but with imaginative desires. So this would be already enough to make a difference. So beliefs motivate with real desires. So if imagination motivated only in pretense and only in conjunction with the I desires, this would reveal some motivational power, but not the same motivational power as belief. And so this is the standard view, simplifying a great deal. And so my view is in line with the standard view in important respects, and in particular, I agree that the relevant difference lies at the functional level. So I think that imagination is a functionally distinctive attitude. But I think that the relevant functional difference has mostly to do with cognitive inputs and not really with the behavioral outputs. And I say a little bit more of what I mean with this. So the key point for me is that beliefs are formed and maintained in response to evidence, real-world evidence, in ways in which imaginings are not. So the formation of our imaginings can be determined by our will, our desires, intention, or basically by any evidence-insensitive factors, while beliefs are tied to evidence and reality. And importantly, among the kinds of evidence to which beliefs, but not imaginings, correspond, there is what I call inferential evidence, constituted by the pre-existing system of a subject belief, which is why beliefs are inferentially integrated with each other into a more or less holistically coherent system in ways in which imaginings are not. So, in fact, the functional differences I'm talking about actually are two. One in the ways in which beliefs are formed, beliefs and imaginings are formed, and the other has to do with their inferential properties and the relations that imaginings and beliefs bear to each other. But for the sake of simplicity, I hope this is not too confusing, I put them together because I take these two differences to, they depend on the same thing, which is belief sensitivity to evidence. So the key difference in my view has to do with the fact that beliefs respond to evidence and imagination doesn't. Well, on the other hand, as I said, I don't see a principled difference in behavioral output. So I want to argue, and this will be the point of this talk, that in spite of appearances, imaginings motivate us to act precisely as beliefs do. And so how do beliefs motivate? On this I conform to a quite standard characterization of belief motivational power, according to which, all else being equal, believing that P motivates one to act in ways that, if P were true, would promote the satisfaction of one's desires. And yeah, I will come back on this all else being equal clause, which is very important for my argument. So let's say a little bit on the reasons behind this view. So my departure from the standard view is due to the fact that, of course, I agree that the standard Explananda like fiction, pretense, and daydreaming, well, not everyone agrees, but I agree with the mainstream that these three phenomena and things like this should be explained in terms of imagining. But I don't take them to be the only ones. That's the thing. So I think that imagination's role in our cognitive life is not limited to standard cases like daydream, fiction, or pretense, but is manifested also in a variety of other domains where imaginings combine with real desires, and not I desires, motivating us to act in relevant ways. And I call these novel imaginative Explananda, since these are now I will introduce them, but these are some new entries in the imagination literature, and they take these cases that I'm going to introduce to reveal that the motivational power of imagination and belief is the same. So the main examples that I've got in mind and that ground my view are what I call superstitious or magical actions. And here I should apologize with some of you who has already heard a talk on superstitious and magical actions, which are a kind of action on which I've been working quite a lot recently. So I have another paper which focuses really just on them. Here I just need a couple of slides because they are important to give you a sense of the motivation behind my view, but I won't bother you too much with superstitious and magical actions, but they are important in the economy of my argument. So I just give you a few examples of what I mean with them and why I take them to be imagination driven. So I use the label superstitious and magical action in a somewhat stipulative way, or at least in a broad way, which, however, matches pretty closely the way in which it is used in the psychological literature. And superstitious or magical actions, in my sense, include not only the traditional superstitious actions like knocking on wood or crossing your fingers, but also what I call personalized superstitious actions. A number of more idiosyncratic and personal practices that literally fill up our everyday life. And so I myself am a good source of examples here, so I just tell you a few of my superstitions. I have plenty of like private propitiatory rituals for my performances. So, for instance, well, I have, of course, lucky sweets for job interviews and talks and public occasions, and also for sport performances. So when I go out climbing or running, I tie up my shoes in special ways, or I use special t-shirts or special things of this sort, lucky charms of various sorts. And actually, before talks, I was thinking, I have this thing that I must always eat a banana before the talk because it contains potassium, and of course, it makes me smarter when I speak. You can see if this is true, or things of this thing. And then I have lucky cracks in the street. I don't know if any of you has this thing, but I must always step on the same lucky crack in the road in order to make sure that my day will be fine, and things like this. So I should be ashamed in outing out with this thing, but I know I'm in a good company, so there is plenty of evidence that people, like there are many social categories in particular. There are studies on the fact that students, athletes, gamblers, of course, politicians, musicians, sailors are all social categories of people famous for the propitiatory rituals they engage with before and during their performances. And so this is the first big group of superstitious actions that fill our lives. Then other famous and widespread superstitious actions are those conforming to the laws of sympathetic magic. This is what Paul Rosen terminology. You may know of those famous experiments where, for instance, subjects were reluctant to throw darts at the photograph of someone they loved, or reluctant to wear a pullover fully sterilized, but that they were told belonged to Adolf Hitler or to a serial killer, or actions of this sort. Then there is the literature on obsessive-compulsive disorders finds that some kinds of superstitious actions are also common in obsessive-compulsive rituals, like things like turning the light on and off 10 times to prevent your grandmother from dying, or things like this. And then there is evidence about people performing actions that in order to avoid tempting fate. So people are reluctant to exchange lottery tickets or to comment boastfully on a streak of success. Or if you ask people to read aloud the sentence, "No one I know will ever get cancer," they don't do that because they think this is tempting fate. And the examples could go on, but I hope this gives you a sense of how widespread these sort of actions I've got in mind are. And these are very disparate actions, different from each other, but what they have in common is this specific kind of thinking that they seem to presuppose. This is what I call superstitious or magical thinking, which is a kind of thinking that departs in various ways from our natural and scientific view of the world. For instance, taking the possibility of action at distance, or taking objects to carry non-physical essences, taking surface similarities as essential and the random coincidences as teleologically significant. And we can see most generally the kind of thinking that tend to see more meaning, purpose, rationality, and agency in the world than there actually is, or more of it than there actually is. And this thinking, importantly, is pervasive also in actions that we do not really typically classify as superstitious. So think of all those cases where we talk to things as if they were animated and could understand us. When you insult your computer, or you ask the door to please remain shut, or things like this. So it's a very pervasive thing. And my idea is, the basic point of these actions, and the reason why I'm mentioning them, is that I think superstitious thinking is imaginative. So we generally ascribe to each other superstitious beliefs, but I think, in fact, in many cases, what we call beliefs are actually imaginings, and imaginings that motivate us to act in ways that jointly with our desire, in the very same ways in which beliefs motivate. And so, for instance, I don't know, to take my last example, when I ask the door to please remain shut, of course, I don't believe that the door can understand me. I just imagine this, and this imagining, together with the real desire for the door to remain shut, is what motivates me. Or when I eat the banana before the talk, I don't really believe that it makes me smarter, but I just imagine that, and this imagining, together with the real desire to give a good talk, is what motivates my action. And so with all my other rituals, and also in traditional superstition. So in my view, people who cross their fingers or knock on wood typically do not really believe that crossing fingers brings out good outcomes. Just imagines that, and this imagining, together with real desire for good luck and good outcome, is what motivates their actions. So most generally, I think superstitious actions are ways in which we seek to satisfy our real desires in imaginative ways. That's my view of superstitious actions. And the thing is, as I said already many times, superstitious actions are very pervasive, so there is plenty of evidence of the fact that magical thinking is ubiquitous, so we tend to have these thoughts intertwined with our realistic thoughts about the world. So superstitious actions are very widespread, and so my idea is that insofar as I'm right that they are imagination driven, and they are cases where imaginings combine with desires in the way in which beliefs combine with desires, they reveal the motivational power of imagination to be on a par with the motivational power of belief. So to get clear on the main structure of my argument, the first premise is that there is a large number of cases where an agent who imagines that P is motivated to act in ways that would promote the satisfaction of her desires if P were true, which are the same ways in which beliefs motivate. The second premise is that insofar as these cases exist, indeed, then we should recognize that imagination and belief have the same motivational power, and hence imagination and belief have the same motivational power. So the first premise is, in important respects, an empirical claim about the mental state that actually motivates us in a number of cases. While the second premise is more conceptual, so it has to do with the consequences that follow if those cases are described in the way I suggest. And so my main argument for the first premise are superstitious actions. And I defend them in this paper and also in other places. I defended an imagination account of superstitious actions. However, here I will not go on defending, this is also because many people have already heard this, but I'm not going to defend, here basically I tried to make my account of superstitions in terms of imaginings intuitively plausible, and I hope some of you are on board, but I don't bring you the empirical evidence that I take to support this account. And the reason why I don't do that is that I want to focus on the second premise of my argument. That is, I want to explore the consequences that follow if this account is correct. And the reason why I focus on the second premise is also that I think the second premise is way more controversial than the first. So one important thing to notice is that in order to endorse P1, you don't necessarily need to buy my account of superstitious or magical actions. So the idea that there is the first premise is with desire. And this is something that on some or some other grounds, many philosophers accept. I don't say everyone, there are people who would reject it, of course, but there is, in particular, the recent literature on belief-behavior mismatches is a literature, like philosophers, you all know probably in the last decades have become very interested in cases of actions that are not clearly explained in terms of what the agents believe. And for many such cases, imagination have been suggested by some to be the state that plays the relevant motivational role. So examples are, again, Tamar Gendler on self-deceptive actions, Greg Curry on delusional actions. More recently, Emma Sullivan-Visset argued that our actions in implicit bias, which is a very widespread phenomenon, are imagination-driven. And then David Velleman and Van Leeuwen argued that expressive actions expressive of our emotions, are imagination-driven. So when you, for instance, kisses the picture of your boyfriend because you are in love with him, this is imagination-driven. You don't believe that you are kissing your boyfriend, you just imagine this, and this imagining together with the desire for kissing your boyfriend motivates you. So there are plenty of examples available of imagination-driven action, cases where imaginings motivate together with real desires. So I'm not saying these accounts are uncontroversial. Of course, they're not the mainstream. In all these cases, the mainstream is to say that our actions are driven by belief. But I'm saying that P1 is accepted by quite a few people, while P2 is very controversial. So I don't know anyone apart from David Velleman, and those of you who are familiar with Velleman's work will see that my argument is somehow inspired to him, although I take my argument to complete his argument in a way. But anyway, I think David Velleman is the only one I know who accepts the second premise. So, because the general idea of these, even people who accept that imagination in many cases motivates jointly with desires, as belief does, the general argument against P2 is this. Those people like Curry, Gendler, or Van Leeuwen, they think, okay, even granting that in a number, however large of cases, imaginings motivate jointly with desires, as beliefs do, there still remain many cases where imaginings do not motivate in such ways. And here my examples before are the obvious examples. So engagement with fiction and daydreaming. So in fiction and daydreaming, we do not act at all upon our imagining. So those cases reveal that there is still a motivational difference. So what I want to do in the remaining part of the talk is to defend the second premise from this sort of criticism. And so this is what I call the natural objection to the second premise of my argument. And let's try to put it a bit more clearly and formally. So the idea of the standard theories is we should distinguish two claims. So the first is the claim that in a number, however large of cases, an agent who imagines that P is thereby motivated to act in the same ways in which she would act if she believed that P, all else being equal. And the second claim is the claim that in any possible case, an agent who imagines that P is thereby motivated to act in the same ways in which she would act if she believed that P. And of course, one does not entail two. And two is what ought to be true if real imagination and belief had the same motivational power. And so the standard theorist says, okay, don't switch so easily from one to two. This is how Van Leeuwen put it. He says, we should not mistakenly generalize from cases in which imagining that P and believing that P happen to yield similar behavior to the conclusion that this holds for all cases. A conclusion, says Van Leeuwen, that is indefensible in virtue of its absurd consequences. And this line of reasoning has been pushed also by Curry and Funkhausen and Spalding. And so my reply to this is really to overturn the criticism. So I think it is this line of criticism that switch too easily from cases where imaginings do not motivate to the conclusion that imagination motivational power differ from the motivational power of belief, overlooking the fact that there are plenty of cases where beliefs do not motivate either. And so here I think a practical example will help to make my point clear. So this is a quite silly example, but let's take a pragmatic case of daydreaming. Like a case I sit at my desk and I start procrastinating. I hang online on Facebook and online newspapers, and I read an article on the royal wedding, and I start daydreaming that I am the Duchess of Cambridge on my wedding day. So we all agree that in a case like this, my daydream doesn't motivate me to act plausibly. So I don't wear a white dress, I don't call my chauffeur, I don't do nothing, but I just sit in front of my computer and stare into space. But my point, as you may imagine at this point, is that it is one thing to agree on this, and it is quite another thing to agree that my daydream imagining doesn't motivate me as a belief with the same content would. Because the point is that it's not so obvious how a belief that I am the Duchess of Cambridge on my wedding day would motivate me. So let's try to ask this. How I would act if I believed that I am the Duchess of Cambridge on my wedding day? And the real answer probably is that I would try to escape before it's too late, because I don't really feel like marrying. Actually, it sounds like a nightmare to me to be married with Prince William. So that is the real answer. But even granting that I had the relevant desire, so that I wanted to get married to Prince William. So would I wear a white dress? Well, I would, if I believed that brides traditionally dress in white, and if I desire to conform to traditional practices, but I wouldn't if I believed that brides dress in yellow, or if I desired to surprise anyone. And would I call my chauffeur? Well, I would if I believed that that's the best way to get to Westminster Abbey, but I wouldn't if I preferred to take a walk. And yes, okay, then I suffer from migraines, and those of you who suffer from migraines know that if you get a bad day, the only thing you can do is to just close up in your room and stay in the darkness and wait for the migraine to go away. So if that was the case, my belief wouldn't motivate me, because I would remain closed in my room, and I would have to wait that headache passes away. So these are silly scenarios, but I take them to reveal something important about the motivational power of belief. So it's something that I mentioned briefly before. So belief connection to action is a dispositional connection, which is expected to manifest itself in the presence of relevant desires, and if a number of other conditions are satisfied, while failures to satisfy such conditions can excuse a lack of behavioral manifestation without compromising the holding of the disposition itself. And this is quite important to keep in mind when we compare belief and imagination motivational power. So it is true that the existence of cases where imaginings motivate us to act jointly with desires are not enough to conclude that imagination motivational power is the same as belief. But in order to prove that their power are the same, we don't have to prove that imagination always motivates us to act jointly with desires. we need to show that imagination motivates us to act jointly with desire under the same conditions under which belief do so. So finally, we are in the position to see what needs to be done to support the second premise of my argument. To support the second premise of my argument, I need to show that whenever I'm imagining that P does not motivate actions that would promote the satisfaction of the agency desires, if P were true, this lack of behavioral manifestation is excused by some condition C that, all else being equal, would also excuse the lack of behavioral manifestation of a belief with the same content. And this is what I am to do in the remaining time. So, Alberto, what is the remaining time?
About 25 minutes.
I have 25 minutes. Yeah. Okay, great.
And then the Q&A.
So, plus the Q&A, okay. Of course, I cannot possibly consider every possible case where imaginings do not motivate. But I will identify some basic factors that, in my view, excuse the lack of behavioral manifestation of paradigmatic cases of especially daydreaming and engagement with fiction. And then I will conclude by shifting the onus of the proof onto my opponent. So the basic factor, I think that there are two main factors that most typically excuse lack of behavioral manifestation of paradigmatic imagining. First are factors concerning the specific contents, propositional contents that such imagining have, and inferential network into which they are integrated. And second, factor concerning the metacognitions that typically accompany our imagining. So in particular, the beliefs and desires that we have about our imagining. And I shall discuss these two factors in turn, and I shall argue that, all else being equal, these very same factors would also excuse the lack of behavioral manifestation of corresponding beliefs. And for this bit of the argument, for the sake of simplicity, I focus on cases of daydreaming, like my daydream that I am the Duchess of Cambridge. But then I hope it will be very easy to see how the same, what I say applies also to engagement with fiction and to other paradigmatic cases of imaginings, and we can discuss this if you are not convinced. So the first factors have to do with what I call contents and inferential network. So a first important reason, in my view, why when I daydream that I am the Duchess of Cambridge, I don't act upon my imagining, is that basically we can say nothing in the content of my imagining really tells me how I should act in order to satisfy my desire. So even if I wanted to act, I would lack the relevant instructions. That's the idea. And to make this point clear, we should make the comparison with belief. So as I said already, a notable feature of belief is that they are inferentially integrated with each other into a more or less holistically coherent system. And the whole system of beliefs to which a given belief that P belongs is crucial in determining what sorts of actions, if any, the belief in question will motivate jointly with relevant desires. And in particular, there is one specific type of belief that must be present in the system in order to allow all the other beliefs to manifest their motivating potential, which are beliefs of the form, I can obtain phi if I perform action A, where phi is the content of one of my relevant desires. So the idea is, if the belief that today is my wedding motivates any action at all, this is, first, I must have some relevant desires. For instance, I must have the desire to dress properly for the wedding, to be on time for the ceremony, and so on. But then I also need beliefs about how to satisfy this desire. So I need the belief that in order to dress properly, I must take my dress from the wardrobe. Or in order to be on time for the ceremony, I must call my chauffeur by 9 a.m. or things like this. Without beliefs of this form, the belief that today is my wedding would fail to motivate me in relevant ways, even in the presence of relevant desires. And my idea is imaginings of this form are typically absent in paradigmatic cases of daydreaming. So daydreams are often things like this, are little more than fleeting scenarios, which remain to a large extent indeterminate in their content. So for a moment, I see myself as the Duchess of Cambridge, and that's all. So I can, of course, enrich this proposition in many ways. I may elaborate on this, but the way in which we elaborate on this typically does not include propositions that specify how to practically implement desire satisfaction. And this is in a way the privilege of daydreaming and of imagining. So you can wear wonderful dresses without worrying about how to try them on beforehand, or you can enjoy a party without worrying about how to get there and things like this. But then my idea is that the indeterminacy of our imaginings with respect to practical implementation of desire is one reason why, not the only reason, but one reason why often they fail to motivate us. If I only figure myself as a duchess, of course this doesn't motivate me, but a belief with the same content wouldn't either. That's the idea. So here is the first excusing condition that I identified, that I think excuse the lack of behavioral manifestation both of beliefs and of imaginings. Both a belief and an imagining that P motivate the agent to act in ways that would promote the satisfaction of her desires. If either P is a proposition of the form I can obtain P if I perform action A, or P is inferentially integrated into a network of believed or imagined propositions, which includes propositions of this form. And if this condition is not satisfied, this can excuse a lack of behavioral manifestation of the belief or imagining in question, without thereby compromising the holding of its behavioral disposition. And since this condition is typically satisfied in paradigmatic cases of, not satisfied in paradigmatic cases of daydreaming, I think many cases of daydream do not reveal the motivational difference between imagination and belief that they are typically taken to reveal. And this condition is important. This highlights in general the importance of the broader network of states to which a given state belongs in order to determine its behavioral manifestations. And I think, but I don't know if I have time to go into this, I don't think, but I think this condition is important not only to understand why imaginings in paradigmatic cases of daydreaming do not motivate any action at all, why we would expect belief with the same content to motivate. But it is also important to understand why, when imaginings do motivate, like in cases of superstitions, the sorts of actions that they motivate are different from the sorts of actions that we would expect from someone who has corresponding beliefs. So superstitious actions are somewhat sui generis. So I just give an example and then I move on, but I don't know, my superstitious grandmother, that's an example I like, because I was always, she didn't travel on Friday the 13th. She avoided that like the plague. But she didn't warn me or other people against traveling on that day. And if from someone who believes that traveling on Friday the 13th is objectively dangerous, you would expect her or him to warn other people against traveling as well. And in my view, the reason why she didn't do that was that she just imagined that. And so she failed to draw many obvious consequences of her imagining. So the fact that imagining motivates differently from a belief with the same content is not due to an intrinsic difference in motivational power, but simply from the fact that you draw different conclusions from your imaginings or from your beliefs. That was the idea. But anyway, that's the first condition, and I move to the other one. As I said, I think there are also other. This is not the only reason why we don't act upon our imaginings in daydreaming. There are other factors that prevent imagining from motivating that are metacognitive factors, so the metacognitions that we have about our imagining. So this imagining is quite obvious, although it may seem too obvious. But if you ask me, when I daydream, I tell you that I'm daydreaming, I'm the Duchess of Cambridge, and you ask me, okay, but why don't you act consequently? I would probably tell you, well, because I know it's just a daydream and I don't see any point in acting upon it. That would be, I think, the obvious answer. And I think there would be some truth in this answer. So typically, in a standard case of daydreaming, the agent imagines that P and believes that she doesn't really believe, but just imagines that P, and desires not to act upon her imagining that P, for this very reason. So we want our action to be realistically purposive, and so we don't see any point in acting upon things that we know are not realistic. And at least in some cases we may want to act upon our, like in pretense, but generally I don't see any point in acting on something that I know is not tied to reality. And these meta-beliefs and meta-desires concerning our own imaginings, in my view, are both factors that prevent the imagining itself from motivating. And what I contend is that either of these two metacognitive factors would also, all else being equal, prevent a belief with the same content from motivating. So if we stick to the royal wedding case, the scenario we get if we keep everything equal, apart from the fact that I believe and not imagine that I am the Duchess of Cambridge, is admittedly somewhat weird. So it's a scenario where I imagine, so I believe that I am the Duchess of Cambridge on my wedding day, but for some reason I come to believe that I don't really believe that, and I come to desire not to act upon my what I take to be my imagining. And this is surely an improbable scenario, but what matters to me, improbable does not mean impossible. So what matters to me is that you grant the following counterfactual claim. So if there is a case where I believe that P, but for some reason I come to believe that I don't believe that, and I come to desire not to act upon it, then I would fail to act upon my belief. So this is the claim I make. I think this is plausible. So what I argue is that all else being equal, if I believe that P, but either I believe that I don't really believe that, or I desire not to act upon P, or both, then you may expect me to fail to act upon my first order belief. And okay, so let's take the two conditions separately. Cases, examples of the first condition, so of cases where I believe that P, but I come to believe that I don't really believe that, are a bit tricky to find, because we tend to think that we have a direct privileged access to our own beliefs, and so that, of course, I know what I believe. How can I be wrong about what I believe? However, I think it may be true that we have a privileged access, but this doesn't mean that errors are impossible. Many people agree that we can be wrong about what we believe. And my point is that in a case in which you are, the wrong meta-belief prevents the first-order belief to manifest in behavior in some ways. So how much time do I have?
Less than a quarter of an hour.
Okay, I can say this quickly. So I have an example of a case like this. So I have 10 minutes about. 13, okay. Let's take, this is an example of because this is something, is a condition I started thinking about recently, and people are generally very resistant to it. I've been thinking for this talk about a case, I don't know if it's convincing, but in which I have a mistaken meta-belief that prevents my belief from showing up in behavior. So it's Gloria who believes that Ben is cheating on her, and she has plenty of evidence about it, and in fact she expresses this belief to Ben. And Ben, of course, tries to persuade her that this is false, and he has very good rhetorical skills, and she manages to persuade her that what she takes to be a belief is just a paranoid imagining. And he says, you are just imagining this, you are paranoid, you know, you have this sort of thing. And we assume that Ben is very good at persuading her, and so you may think that in so doing he's just persuading her that he's not cheating on her. But in my view, it's also possible that he manages, this is I think a psychologically plausible possible scenario, he manages to persuade her that what she takes to be a belief is just a paranoid imagining, although she still believes that he's cheating on her. So she has plenty of evidence about him being cheating, and indeed her emotional reactions keep revealing that she believes so. So she keeps feeling very upset and keeps feeling very jealous. Still, for a little while at least, she comes to tell herself, well, I'm just imagining this, in fact he's right, I'm paranoid, I always tend to be too jealous and things like this. So I think a case like this, you may think it is rare. I don't think so, and I think psychological literature shows that we are often wrong about our own beliefs. But at least I would like you to grant that a case like this is psychologically possible. And I think that in a case like this, where I believe that P, but I come to believe that it's just an imagining, I would fail to act upon my belief in some ways. For instance, if you asked in that, at least for a little while, I asked Gloria how is her relationship with Ben, and she say, oh, it's very good actually. I was thinking that he was cheating on me, but I was paranoid as always, or things like this. So the first order belief, if you have a wrong meta-belief, would not motivate behavior in the way in which it would if you didn't have the meta-belief. So that's the case. Anyway, that's the first condition. I think cases of the second condition are much easier to find, and I think pretense is a clear case. So take the child who pretend that he's a cat and that can reply to your questions only by meowing. Of course, she still believes that she's a child and can reply in fluent Italian or English, but for the duration of the game, she desires not to act upon the belief that she's a child and to act upon the imagining that she's a cat instead. So this is a case. So if you desire not to act upon your belief, you may fail to act upon it in various ways. Also, lying is another case. So, I mean, if you are convinced about these two cases, anyway, I am. And so the metacognition, the excusing condition that I propose is the metacognition condition, according to which both a belief that P and an imagining that P motivate the agent to act in ways that would promote the satisfaction of her desires, if P were true, unless the agent believes that she doesn't really believe that P, or desires not to act upon her representation of P. And if either A or B are the case, this may excuse lack of behavioral manifestation of the belief or imagining in question, without thereby compromising the holding of the behavioral disposition. And since A and B are typically the case in paradigmatic cases of daydreaming, I think cases of daydreaming do not reveal the motivational difference between imagining and belief that they are typically taken to reveal. So I move, so this is my second excusing condition. And to sum up what I said so far, I have identified two basic factors that typically prevent daydream imagining from motivating, even in the presence of relevant desires, that are absence of imaginings about the sort of actions that should be performed in order to satisfy such desires, and the presence of what we can call inhibiting metacognition. And as we have seen, even just one of these two factors would be enough to prevent belief from motivating. And so here I focused on cases of daydream, but I think the same factor would excuse the lack of behavioral manifestation in many other cases of imaginings, and in many cases of engagement with fiction in particular. And so what I argue is that the same factor would be responsible for many other lack of behavioral manifestations. I can, of course, think of cases where imaginings do not motivate due to the presence of different factors, for instance, physical impairment, but these are always factors that, all else being equal, would also prevent belief from motivating. So what I cannot easily think of is a case where an imagining does not motivate, while all else being equal, a belief with the same content would. And so here is my challenge. So can you think of a case like this, a case where an imagining does not motivate while all else being equal, a belief with the same content would? I would like to insist that no such case exists. And as long as you don't come up with a counterexample, which is very dangerous to say to a room of philosophers, but I conclude that imagination and belief dispose us to act in the same ways, and do that under the same conditions. So they may contingently differ with respect to the satisfaction of such conditions, but they do not differ intrinsically in motivational power. And so to come up to my question about how does imagination differ from belief, I argued that they don't differ in behavioral outputs because they have the same motivational power, but this suggests that the key difference should be sought at the input level, broadly construed in the way I indicated, so including how imaginings and beliefs are maintained, and relatedly their inferential properties, so how they are inferentially related to each other. And I think, here I focus mostly on the negative part, on how they do not differ. There would be much more to say on the positive part, and if you want, we can discuss in the Q&A. So I think what I call the input level is a broad and articulated thing, so I can say more on this. But that's it. Thank you.